Stephen Fitzgerald is the Extension, Silviculture, and Fire Specialist with the Oregon State University Extension Service. He is also Director of the College of Forestry Research Forests, which encompasses nearly 15,000 acres. Steve currently holds the rank of Professor in the Department of Forest Engineering, Resources and Management in the College of Forestry and has been with OSU for 37 years. Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me. I don't mind being a guinea pig. I think I've been a guinea pig on a lot of these over the last 6 months. So there's always something to learn, including myself. But anyway, I was asked to talk about post-fire regeneration, reforestation. I know that it's been really hard on people. And I know it's been heart-wrenching, and I reach out to you humbly in the sense that some of you may have lost your property, trees, and then you put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into those, and it's always heartbreaking to see that burn up. And so it's time to start from anew, and some of that starts with planting trees in places on your property, perhaps. And so what I wanted to do is talk a little bit of what it takes to do that. So I believe I have about an hour, and then there's time for questions, but I've broken this up so that there's questions in the middle. And I guess, you know, the thing is why would you want to reforest your property after wildfire? I mean, it probably answers itself, but there are a lot of different reasons for doing that. And one is to restore forest cover and the associated habitats with conifer forest, as well as hardwood forest. Oftentimes planting can better assure that trees will reestablish, particularly if there's a lack of desired seed sources on that site. But even with some seed sources present, active reforestation is quicker and oftentimes more assured than relying on natural seeding. And we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm a proponent of natural seeding, but I'm also realize it doesn't work in some cases. So although this talk isn't about salvage does play into this. So if you salvage timber, reforestation is required after salvaging. And I know some people are salvaging their timber on the Obichain fire as we speak. Planting also gives us an opportunity to change the species composition on our sites, particularly in light of climate change, that perhaps certain species are declining in health, maybe going away, particularly on their ecological edge. And maybe this is an opportunity to change up some of the species, or at least change the genetic seed source that may be more adapted to a changing climate. So what I'm going to do is cover kind of the basic steps. And a lot of times there's not too many, this isn't too much different than the steps you'd follow in reforestation after maybe a harvest in some cases. But so there are very similar steps, but we'll talk about those, talk about achieving free to grow, and that's a technical and legal term. Do want to talk about natural and artificial regeneration. Artificial regeneration, I mean planting seedlings that maybe you purchase. Talk about climate. Vegetation control is an important topic to discuss because it affects seedling survival and growth. And talk a little bit about salvage and sources of seedlings. So here we go. So I do have a publication for you that kind of provides the overview of reforestation and the things you need to think about, so you don't have to take a lot of notes. I don't know if this is being recorded and maybe made available later, but I'll keep moving on here. So if you have questions, you can write them in the chat as we go, and then we'll take some of those questions about halfway through. So maybe as a backdrop for this is that, you know, 1 million acres burned in Oregon this past year, and there's been a lot of talk and discussion about how many seedlings will be needed to replant a lot of these areas. What species and what seed sources should we be using? And where will we get the seed? We do have quite a bit of seed in the seed bank, but the other question is who will grow them? The seedling nurseries probably can ramp up production given orders, but those are all questions that we've been wrestling with here the last 6 months or so. So I don't know what all your personal objectives are for your property, but I thought maybe you probably land on somewhere on this spectrum and thinking about a reforestation after fire or after fire and salvage. And you might have a more passive approach to managing your property. You know, maybe you're not going to salvage, kind of let nature take its course. Others may be more active in their management and maybe are planning on salvage and then having to replant, actively replant after that. But I suspect that most people are somewhere in the middle, and that they manage their property, maybe not intensely, but they manage some of it. They may be interested in natural seeding, maybe some planting here and there. They might do some salvage in some areas and plant that. But I recognize that everybody has a different approach to their property, and I don't want to prescribe any one thing. That's up to you. But hopefully your questions, we can tease some of these things out. The other thing would be about whether to know going ahead here on reforestation after fire is whether you're going to salvage as well. And so assessing injury to trees and their damage, and how many trees, you know, are there trees that maybe will survive, and will they provide seed for natural regeneration? That's really important. But know that not all properties burn equal. They're not all severe or all low. A lot of properties burn with a mixed severity. But the injury that trees can succumb to is both the heat and crown scorch, where the foliage and the buds are killed by heat or maybe consumed. And so here we have a Douglas fir that's most of the crown's been killed, and probably low likelihood of survival, and probably very little likelihood of producing enough seed to naturally regenerate a site. And then here's another one that's pretty good, has a good crown, and probably has good cone producing potential for natural seeding. Of course, trees, sometimes the crowns can look good, but if the bole or the roots, the top of the roots are charred and charred deep, the tree can still die. And so that's another aspect that we look at, you know, the root collar. And some of this depends on the species and how thick the bark is. Douglas fir, mature Douglas fir has fairly thick bark as ponderosa pine, but other species like true firs, or in this case, like a grand fir or a Western hemlock, even though there's not much bole char on this hemlock, you can see the char at the base and the roots. This tree is actually toast. But other factors can affect the survival of trees that you potentially leave. So the species, what was its vigor before the fire? Were there bark beetles operating in the area? Are there bark beetles in there now working on trees that have been stressed by fire damage? And drought, the drought either before, during, or even a prolonged drought after a fire might affect the survivability of these trees, and therefore the ability to produce seed and for natural regeneration. So just a quick thing about salvage. The salvage or not to salvage, of course, depends on, and this is a picture that Marty Main provided for a landowner that was thinking as doing some salvage on the Oba chain. But do you have enough timber volume to actually harvest? And what are the current log prices for those species that you have? What are the logging costs to actually harvest that timber? And can you quickly salvage it before it loses significant value through defect and decay? And that's important because once you salvage, you have to reforest, and that's going to cost you something. And so making sure you can maximize the value out of the trees you have to help pay for that reforestation cost is a consideration. But the biggest one now is a logger available to do it within a time frame where the trees are still have some value. A lot of you may have wildlife concerns, and so thinking about how you salvage and where you might leave snags and other trees for wildlife, either individually or in clumps, like this one here. And also safety is an issue when it comes to harvesting and leaving snags on the site. And of course, if you salvage, this is where we're getting to, is reforestation after that is required. So in all of this, of course, planting is important in trying to match the seedlings to the site, both the species and the genetic match. And from that, ordering the seedlings you might need. It may take a year to 2 years to grow your seedlings. Preparing the site. And some sites, I mean, theoretically, after a fire, the site's already prepared. It's ready to be planted. But if you salvage, then you've got a step in there that take care of slash and things like that. But how do you, once you get your seedlings, how do you transport them, handle them? How do you plant them correctly so that they will survive and grow? And then monitoring their survival and growth and potential damage. And this is a really important step. And you want to, this step here, monitoring, you want to do this within the first go out on the site a couple of times during the first growing season to see how they are doing. You know, are deer munching on your trees? And so do you need to take a corrective action? So I've seen areas that I have planted on the McDonald Dunn forests, on the OSU forest, where deer have really annihilated our seedlings. We've had to go back and replant. So as I mentioned, planting is important, trying to describe the type of site that the seedling or describe the seedling environment so that you can match these up correctly, identify the kind of if you have any management or operational constraints that might affect how you approach reforestation after fire. And thinking about what kind of reforestation options you might prescribe in certain areas. Some areas, maybe you can do natural regeneration, and other places you may not have the seed sources to do that. And so that other area might need to be planted. Of course, obtaining and planting the seedlings, and a big one again also is now, can you find a planting contractor to do the planting if it involves large acreages? So, you know, maybe most of us could plant an acre or two, but if you're beyond that, and depending on your health and your ability, I know that I find that planting trees, I can't plant as many as I used to. And I come home a lot more sore than I used to in my younger days. So, so what is a free to grow seedling? And this is in the Oregon Forest Practices Act. You know, after harvest, you know, you are required to plant trees after salvage or after timber harvest, but the trees need to be what they say free to grow after year 6. So free to grow actually means that, you know, the seedlings are well established, they're healthy, and they have the ability to outdistance or grow continue to grow above and beyond the vegetation that they're competing with. In other words, you could walk away and not have to do any further intervention to keep those seedlings alive and growing. And this is a post, the picture here shows a gentleman, this is after a salvage and fire salvage, and this is the beginning of the 3rd year after the fire. They planted these trees right away. Essentially, the fire created the site preparation for them, and these trees are, pine trees are very vigorous, and within another year will be free to grow. This seedling is a Douglas fir. It's right there if you can't see it. This is struggling in a stand of blue blossom ceanothus, and so this seedling is not free to grow. It would require some intervention, whether it's hand treatment to give this seedling a little light and to let it release and take over the spot. Some of your options, as I mentioned, is for reforestation is planting seedlings, actively planting them, which is common. Natural regeneration that occurs either from seeding, sprouting, or layering, or using other more active silvicultural techniques like seed tree or shelter wood cutting. But in post-fire situations, it really depends on what's available for seed. Advanced regeneration is natural regeneration that occurred with no help from you. It just happened on its own. And the question is, under fire, did a lot of if you had advanced regeneration, did it burn up, or is there pockets of it still left that you could count on? And then there's maybe a combination of natural and planting that you might do depending on your site. So I want to just kind of pause here just a little bit to talk about natural regeneration. And so, we look around at our forests and we go, wow, look at all those forests. They just happen to grow on their own. And then we go and we harvest trees and, we leave some seed trees or whatever, and nothing happens. Can't find a natural seedling. I can't, or if they are, they're very far and few between. It's like, what's up with that? It's like, how did these other forests get here? And there's probably 3 important aspects of natural regeneration for successful natural regeneration. Of course, the first is got to have a seed source. So, but even with a seed source that is seed trees, either from trees left on site that are of cone producing age, or trees adjacent to the fire that are mature and can cast seed into the burned area or into an area that you salvaged after a fire. But even then, that does not guarantee that those trees will produce seed for regeneration, because cone production is periodic. That is, trees don't produce cones every year. And a lot of trees only produce a lot of cones maybe every 7 to 8 years. Some trees produce a reasonable amount of cones every 1 or 2. And so you could leave good seed trees, but you may not get any seed out of them for a number of years, depending on the species. So just know that. And timing of when the seed, if you think about you're a seed and you float down from the cone onto the soil surface, think about the factors that affect the survival and germination of that seed. And part of that is the seed bed. So nearly all conifers regenerate or best on mineral soil. We know this from a lot of studies. And a post-fire situation is great because it produces a lot of mineral soil potentially for conifer seed to germinate on, and for those seed to put down their, what we call the radicle, which is the root, and get it down into more moist mineral soil below. And so that's important. And after a fire, we generally have a pretty good seed bed. But the other part of that is the environment. Once the seed lands on the seed bed, and the seed bed is mineral soil, is that what is the environment at the point of germination and early growth of that germinate? And so right in the middle here, these are germinates that have come up. These are pine germinates that have come up. And you can see there's a bunch of them here from the cones. And so thinking about, if seeds were germinating right now, this weekend, what's the weather supposed to be? It's going to be almost red flag warning, 80 degrees plus, windy, dry. And it could be that as that little seed is germinating, it dries out. And so a significant amount can die just from, a very hot, warm spring. Maybe there's a drought. Maybe there's not a lot of soil moisture. So all those factors affect, even when you have seed, how successful they will be at germinating and then growing. And so sometimes I feel that all the planets have to align in order to get kind of successful natural regeneration. For sure, you got to have a seed source. If everything else aligns and you don't have a seed source, it's not going to happen. Other than species that sprout, like some of your hardwoods, they have an advantage. So here's a fire on the dry side of the Cascades. You can see most of the trees in the background are burned or dead. There's a little pocket here that trees have been scorched and have survived or relatively unscathed. This is the potential here in this area for natural regeneration. And so this may be a place that if you get natural regeneration, you wouldn't have to plant. But if you look back here and you salvage that, then most likely there's very few survivors back there to provide seeds. So, the seed the dispersal is limited depending on the weight of the seed, and that varies by species. So if you look at sugar pine, Jeffrey pine, ponderosa pine, they have heavy seed, and so they don't disperse as far from the parent tree as other species like Douglas fir or western hemlock, which have a lighter seed. And of course, a lot of that depends on wind patterns, and you can see the distance from the parent tree depending on wind patterns. But for heavy seeded trees, it's less than one tree length to maybe two tree lengths. But for light seeded trees, it's from 2 to 6 or 7 tree lengths away. So important consideration. So just to maybe contrast natural and planting, is that natural regeneration, if you can get it, it's locally adapted seed. If it takes, you get less upfront costs because you got your seedlings for free, really. The only problem would be is that if you don't get natural seeding or it's really delayed, your costs may increase because you may have to go back, and particularly if you salvaged and maybe replant a bit to enhance the survival and stocking to meet reforestation requirements. If you haven't salvaged, then you're not on the hook to replant it at all. Just remember that the seed years are infrequent. Douglas fir is about every 7 years. Ponderosa pine every 6 to 8 has a really good bumper crop. Western hemlock produces seed fairly regularly every couple of years. Lodgepole pine in higher elevations produces seed every couple of years. So they are more reliable seed producers. And as I mentioned, the seed bed is important for the establishment and germination establishment of natural regeneration. Of course, with planting, it's quicker, maybe more reliable. If you've salvaged harvest, you can meet your reforestation requirements. There is a higher upfront cost because you have to purchase the seed, have it grown, and then have it planted. And so that can cost you, a couple $100 to $400 an acre to do that, depending on how much of the planting you do yourself. There is an opportunity to change up the species a bit. If you find that some of your species are not doing well because it's getting too hot and dry, you could put the next, you could change it up so that with species that are more adapted to warming temperatures or hotter conditions on some of your sites. And particularly in light of maybe some climate change impacts that both trees and forests are feeling these days. So here's a site that burned in one of the West Side fires. Here I've outlined some areas that might be left for seed and for habitat and for future harvest, perhaps. The green area surrounded by the red. And then other areas that might be salvaged, that there's not much survivable seed trees in, where we could do a combination of natural regeneration and planting. There's a meadow right here that was here before the fire. There's no need to plant, and that actually creates a fuel break. And so there could be a combination of planting and natural regeneration following this salvage. But here we got seed trees here, 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 interspersed throughout the property. So a lot of this begins with kind of assessing that environment that you're going to be planting seedlings or seed that is going to germinate. And so looking at the aspect and slope, elevation, competing vegetation and animals, and potential for root disease. This is a slide I showed earlier on the Obachain, and this is a pretty tough site. Some sparse ponderosa pine, not very big, a lot of hardwoods, oak, kind of rocky. And so trying to assess the site for potential for regeneration is important, and looking at species and their tolerance to various environmental conditions. And maybe their susceptibility to insect problems or disease problems. And we're going to look at what I mean by a genetic fit, and then look at seedling stock type, size, and form that might oftentimes be a good fit for different kinds of sites. So I think if any of you have gone through any of the Master Woodland Manager trainings that I put on in conjunction with Max, it's oftentimes we talk about tree tolerances to environmental things, such as shade, their tolerance to frost, their tolerance to wet or moisture, and their tolerance to drought and heat. And if you look at, say, ponderosa pine down here, is if you look under shade, it doesn't like a lot of shade. It can handle a little bit. It's really tolerant of frost or cold. And it can handle wet, poor drainage areas. And it can also handle drought and heat. And of course, you have a lot of it down there, and it does pretty well on some of those harsher sites compared to, say, other species like Western hemlock, which I know is not necessarily in your area other than towards the coast range. But Douglas fir is kind of middle of the road on all these, except that it does not like wet, waterlogged sites. It's kind of middle of the road on shade and on frost and on heat. So trying to match up the talents that a species has for a particular site is really, really important. Other things that you can do to assess a site would be to look at the soils maps that NRCS has online, to look at different types of soils that may be more beneficial for conifer growth, may have a higher water holding capacity, things like that. But you can let the vegetation tell you changes in soil. So like you can have a conifer stand and then all of a sudden have oak, and that usually tells you there's a soil type change. And so those kind of clues. The other thing is what was grown there historically. from stumps and things like that, and what was the health of those trees. Other things include, the soil type and rain, and does the soil remain soggy after rain or whatever? Is it a sunny or shady spot? Are there things like wet seeps where the vegetation, like sedges and things like that, might tell you it's a little wetter? You could use different species there. So the site can tell you a lot. I mentioned the genetic fit for seedlings, and I guess what I would preface this is that if you're looking to plant, Douglas fir, is that we wouldn't take Douglas fir, say, from the North Coast and plant it down in the Medford area. From a genetic perspective, that is too far of a distance, and so trees, their genetic background, they are adapted to their local environmental conditions, as far as degree days, bud burst, dormancy, things like that. And so obtaining and growing seedlings that came from seed from your area, what we call seed zone, is really important in matching them up genetically so that they will perform. If you move a tree too far, if you took ponderosa pine, say, from Northeast Oregon and planted it down there, that is too far away. And oftentimes those trees, what we call, are off-site. They often have chronic health problems. And so forest health begins with matching that genetic source to your site. So here we see seed zones for Douglas fir. They've changed over time. And so the new seed zones are on the right, and you notice they're narrower and more linear north to south. But you can order seedlings based on your seed zone. And I think I'll go to this slide. So this has the old seed zones. If you go to a nursery, they may have the old seed zone number for Douglas fir, and they have them for pine, and they have them for other species. But this one here also shows the new ones. And so for many of you on the OBA chain, I think you're in seed zone 16. The old seed zone was 502. And I think if you're had property in the Slater fire, I think that's over here. That's seed zone 2. And so you could obtain seed from seed zones 2 and have them grown in nurseries for you to be planted out in a year to 2 years on your property. And reason I mention this is that trees that are off-site, like these right here, are chronically ill, or they perform poorly and often have needle disease. Like these trees that are kind of chlorotic or that light green look, their growth rates are not great. These trees are just getting merchantable. And this person got these from surplus seedlings, but didn't know where the seed source was. And so they're not as performing as well as like this one here, which was a native or local tree that he planted here from local seed source. So let's see, I did want to, I'm running, I don't want to run out of time, but thinking about climate change, I'm gonna, there's different assessments of how quickly the climate will change and how the vegetation will shift with that change. And so this is just one estimate of Douglas fir is in the red, and this is where it currently is, and then in 50 to 70 years where it might be. And so you can see that you can see it's retracted in some places and expanded in others. The expansion is in the light green area. So you can see that, perhaps the Willamette Valley or even, might become more Douglas fir dominated. You can see Southwest Oregon, more of it goes away. So these are some of the things that we're wrestling with. And people say, well, should I be taking seedlings from California and planting them up here? And the answer is no. But thinking about movement of where to get genetic stock to anticipate, say, a higher or a warmer, drier climate, we think about that as assisted migration. There's a really good study, that's a common garden study, where they planted Douglas fir from a variety of different sources, from California to Washington, and planted them out in different, what we call common gardens across the range of Douglas fir. And this one happens to be in Oregon. And you can see here just the size and color of trees that are doing well versus that are not. The photo on the right shows a Douglas fir that was from a California seed source. It was planted in Oregon, and it is not happy. It's got chronic needle disease. And even though this tree might be adapted to a future climate here in Oregon, it isn't adapted to the climate now. And so that's the tug of war that we have, is trying to maybe move trees in baby steps, not big leaps. And there are some different tools. The first tool to use is the seed zone maps that I showed you. Those are good. There is a new tool that's called the climate-based seed deployment. It's a seed selection tool that's developed by OSU and the USDA Forest Service to look at finding genetic stock that would grow in a future climate. So I did a run looking at trying to plant Douglas fir on the McDonald-Dunn forest out of Corvallis, thinking about what the climate's going to be in 30 or 40 years. And so I ran this tool, and it basically said that anything here in the kind of the bright, darkest red would be a genetic match for where the McDonald-Dunn forest is. And so you can see this is seed zone 8, and you can see that right here on the more on the west side of seed zone 8 is that there's a lot of seed within the seed zone. There's plenty. We did take some seed actually from the Roseburg area, and we're planting it on the MacDunn as a test. And so this is what I'm talking about: baby steps, moving maybe some genetic here, seed source here, putting it up here a little further north in anticipation of those higher temperatures. We'll see. This is a long-term venture, and there's no quick fix. So this is photos from, of course, Southwest Oregon, and you've been experiencing problems with hot and dry conditions, with pine going out, Douglas fir going out in places, and even areas like this where young trees are flagging out from high temperatures, low precipitation. Of course, this site here has Oregon white oak on it, so that tells you something right there, that perhaps this site cannot support Douglas fir or this much Douglas fir. And so important kind of key indicator. And other sites like this out of Roseburg is that here's a Douglas fir tree that was growing vigorous, but it is not happy where it's at. This is a drier site, warmer site. You can see it's dying from the top down, and these cones are called stress cones. And so I would say that Douglas fir on this site right here, or this spot, is probably not going to be the long-term winner. But there is a ponderosa pine right there that perhaps this site is transitioning to something that ponderosa pine or Oregon white oak would do well on. So I'll just keep moving on here, but I guess maybe I can stop, Jerry, and see if there's any questions, quick questions. I think I'm running short on time, but.
At this point, Steve, you don't have any questions. I'll remind people that if you have a question, can upload one in the Q&A. You can also
Okay.
write it in the chat. The other
Okay.
thing is I've put a link in the chat. It's a reference publication for today that you can click on to see some more of this information.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll continue to move through this. So as I mentioned, seedlings are grown in a forest nursery like this. This is Douglas fir. This represents seed from around the state. From different seed zones are grown here, and then those seedlings are lifted and packed and then sold to landowners back in the appropriate seed zone where their property is at. There are different stock types, what we call, and this is different age and form of seedlings. The ones on the left are what we call container seedlings. They're grown in a container or a plug. Maybe you've heard that. And so S10, S15, S20, that refers to a plug that is either 10 cubic inches with soil and root, or 15 cubic inches of soil, root, or 20. We plant a fair amount of these 15s. On the right-hand side are what we call bare root seedlings, like the one I just showed in that nursery photo. A 2.0 is a 2-year-old seedling that's sown in a garden bed, and it grows there for 2 years, and it's lifted and sorted and then sold. A 1.1 seedling, you can see it's bigger, has a more robust root system, is a 2-year-old seedling where it's grown in a bed for 1 year at a high density. Then they're lifted and planted in another bed at a wider spacing to get this more robust seedling. And they also do some root undercutting to encourage these dense fibrous root systems. And so we talk about managing stand density. Well, this is ultra seedling density management. And then a 2.1 is a 3-year-old seedling that started out as a 2.0, and then they were lifted and planted at a much wider spacing to get this much, much larger seedling. Of course, this is a much more expensive seedling. It's much harder to plant because it's so big. It's not a seedling you'd plant on a south hot slope. It would not do well. There's this publication that's a source of where you can look at for nurseries that grow trees, seedlings, all species, not just Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, but a variety that you can purchase. And usually the cost is, it's either per 100 seedlings or per 1,000 seedlings, depending on how much you're going to buy. But in this document, you can go to a nursery and see if they either have currently seedlings in their inventory that match your seed zone and perhaps your elevation, or if you're going to salvage but you're not ready to plant for another year or two, you could order them grown, put a deposit down, and then pick them up, 1 year or 2 years from now, and then plant them out on your property. So. But there may be other places you could check with ODF locally and OSU Extension if they know any surplus sources, the Forest Service or BLM, whether they have anything extra. There in Northeast Oregon, there's a local reforestation cooperative up there, but there's also this forest seedling network, and they oftentimes advertise seedlings for different zones. It's worth checking out to see if there are any seedlings available for your seed zone and elevation. People often ask, well, how dense should I plant my trees, whether it's after timber harvest or whether it's after fire? And, there's no, there's kind of a minimum density for after harvest that to meet reforestation practice rules, but a lot of what you plant in the density depends on what's already there. So like this site has some trees. If you have trees up here in the overstory, you don't need to plant underneath. This is considered stocked. But maybe you've got some natural regeneration occurring on its own from these trees. That's great. But maybe you've got a spot here that maybe you don't have very many seedlings, and maybe that's where you want to plant some. And so you might get a combination of natural and planted, but a lot of it depends on your objectives and the site productivity. I mean, I'm not a fan of planting trees precisely. I mean, if here for Douglas fir, you know, we plant about trees on average at 11 by 11, but we don't plant exactly 11 by 11. I look for good microsites to plant trees. I look for that shade. And so there could be 20 feet between a seedling, and then maybe there might be 5 feet between two seedlings. So it's highly variable, and it has a more natural look rather than a plantation type look. But it all depends on your objectives. So, so again, you don't have to, you can vary the spacing. It doesn't have to be perfect. But you can check with ODF to see what the minimum stocking level would be for your site, given its where it's located and its productivity. So an important thing is preparing the site. And when we prepare the site for planting after fire or after salvage, it's one of the things that we do is look at how to temporarily control competing vegetation or set it back a bit, how to create planting spots. That's not a problem really after a fire if you're not, but after salvage, if you have slash, you got fuel to reduce and maybe break up the fuel so that you have an area that you can plant. Maybe reduce habitat for certain animals that might browse or clip, like pocket gophers and things like that. If you're looking for natural regeneration, creating mineral soil, but after a fire, that's already been done for you. But there may be cases where on your property, your soil might be compacted from prior land management activities, or maybe if you salvage, there may be areas that are compacted from the machinery that you want to break that compaction up and then replant it in more uncompacted type soil conditions. Of course, the various options, and this depends on you, is chemicals or by using a herbicide, like a spot application, like this one here. They've got a little protector and doing a little spot spray. If you don't want to use herbicides, there's other methods like mechanical, manual, either a weed eater or using a hoe to kind of create a plantable, low vegetation spot. Sometimes fire, and using mats like weed control mats. I like these because they control vegetation and they do it for a long time depending on the type of mat you use, and maybe various combinations. But the option you pick really depends on your site and your objectives and their constraints. So the competition can take on many forms. So you can have shrubs that overtop seedlings that you plant and might limit the seedlings for light and for moisture. In other places, maybe it's grasses, sedge, or forbs that maybe don't limit the seedling for light, but they're water limiting because they are consuming so much water at the expense of the seedling, because the seedling roots are within the same zone as the grass. And so somehow temporarily reducing that competition the first year or two is important to get that seedling established, because the vegetation will come back, but once the seedling's established, it can handle that competition. And so what we do know is that the more area you control around a seedling, up to about 10 feet, the better the seedling survival and growth is. And we know that early competition, like that first 2 or 3 years, is from herbaceous vegetation like grass, actually may be more limiting than from shrubs. An example of this is from a study in Northeast Oregon with ponderosa pine, where they did different treatments. They had a control, they had a small kind of a spot application, a large spot application. They did a what we call a broadcast with a backpack sprayer, and once, and then they came back, and you'd never do this, but they went back over the seedlings 2 years in a row with a broadcast application to control grass. And with the control, 6 years after planting, there's the seedling. It is not free to grow. With just a little bit of control, the small spots produced seedlings like this consistently. So this is a free to grow seedling after 6 years. And you could walk away from this and it'd be fine. So this one's free to grow. An example that I have from a study that I put in the late 90s and early 2000s in Central Oregon. This is a seedling that was planted the second year after a fire. And I actually put a 6x6 mat around this treatment. You can see that right here. And this mat, this seedling here is, well, it's a sapling, and it is 7 years old from planting. It was a 2-year-old seedling, a 2.0 seedling that we planted. So the vegetation wasn't outrageous. We got it in before the vegetation got too robust, but then we kept the vegetation at bay with this mat. Now, this is not practical 6x6, but a 4x4 would really work. We had 3x3s that weren't much different than a control. And this is only in 15 inches of precipitation. That early competition, controlling it is really important. Once they get established, then you can walk away. Now, what happens if you had an area that you said, well, I wanted it burned, I didn't salvage it, but I had some seed trees, or I was hoping for natural regeneration and of conifers. And so you're after the fire, after about 5 or so years, it may look like this, where there are actually no regeneration of conifers because there was no seed, no cone crop, and the vegetation now has come back. And so you have a pretty competitive environment. Maybe you decided, well, I want to put some seedlings, some conifers back on this site. What can I do? Well, depending on your resources, you could have a machine come through and like a masticator and kind of do a little bit of site prep, mechanical site prep in here, and then plant in those areas where there's mineral soil. You don't have to have 100% coverage with site prep. Or, maybe you come in and you create plantable spots where you control the vegetation, either by grubbing the soil with some kind of a hand machine, or with a hoe, or maybe you do a spot application of a herbicide and then plant seedlings back in these treated spots. And so this may be a way that in this kind of environment that, one, it's very diverse, but you've gotten conifers reestablished back in here that over time will eventually take over the site. But in the meantime, it's pretty diverse with a lot of shrubs and forbs. I'm getting near the end here, and of course, picking up your seedlings and the timing for planting. Typically, we plant on the west side in the winter, December through March. There's been some fall planting done in the Coast Range, like mid-September to early October. I don't think too much fall planting has been done down in Southwest Oregon. On the east side, we typically plant in the spring. If you're a seedling, you got lifted out of the nursery, one of the things to think about is keep them cool and moist from the time you pick them up to the time you deliver them to the planting site, and then have them planted out immediately so that they're not in the sun, they're not drying out and getting stressed before you actually put the tree in the ground. And so you want to handle the bags or the boxes gently. You want to make sure they're in the shade, or maybe there's ice or some kind of way to keep them cool while you're planting them out. And we only take out enough seedlings that we plant in a day, or a half a day, out to the site. There are different tools, and maybe some of you have used these, from a power auger to a heavy-duty planting shovel to a planting spade. And this little spade here is used for planting plugs. And then over here is a hoe dad. And this is a big, long hoe. You can use the side to scrape or grub vegetation away, and then use the hoe to plant the seedling. We tend to use shovels or spades like this. And it's important in planting to kind of clear the space of debris, and so that you are planting this tree in mineral soil and no debris gets down into the hole, because it will dry out. The seedling roots need to be in contact with mineral soil. And so it's important not to have any air pockets, things like that, within the hole, or woody debris. And here's just an example of different, things not to do. Planting them too deep where you're burying branches, too shallow where the roots are exposed. An air pocket, sometimes an air pocket can happen because you don't tamp it correctly, or maybe you get a ball of snow. We were planting in snow, and if snow gets in the hole, then it melts, then you have a pocket of air rather than mineral soil against the roots. Maybe not digging a hole big enough, but shoving the seedlings in, you get these L or J roots, or getting too much debris in the hole. But anyway, here's just an example of a nicely planted seedling. As I mentioned, I like to plant seedlings in good microsites, and particularly for that first year when the seedlings have short roots and they're developing new roots, is using some shade to take the heat load off these seedlings so that the water demand is less while they're developing roots that first year. And so I like to use a shade of stumps or debris, things like that. And I'm going to finish up here. Of course, you have to always be on the alert for things that might eat or damage your seedlings: deer, elk, gophers, voles, porcupines, things like that. I had a site last year that I planted some little plugs, and they were doing great. And they flushed, and about 2 weeks after they flushed, the deer came and clipped 70% of all the terminal leaders on my seedlings. And so there are different ways to protect seedlings, using things like Vexar tubing or other chemical repellents like deer away. In some cases, maybe trapping or baiting certain species like mountain beaver or gophers or something like that. Reducing habitat by, so this is applying deer away on ponderosa pine in a deer winter range area where they were hammering some of these seedlings. So I guess, the post-planting, it's always good to go out after you plant, like say June and maybe August and then October, to go see how those seedlings that you just planted are doing, and to see if there's any problems, whether seedlings are dying in pockets, and trying to figure out, kind of troubleshoot what's happening, or maybe they're getting browsed, and maybe you have to do some kind of intervention, like put tubes on your trees or something to prevent more damage. Because if they do that, then you may be faced with having to come back later and interplant, which is an extra cost. So anyway, I'm going to end it here, but this is kind of just a summary, but I guess given the time, I guess, Jerry, we could probably open it for a question and answer and make this really informal.
That would be fine. If anybody has any questions, none have been submitted as of this time. If anybody has any questions, please put them into the question and answer window or in the chat.
Quiet group.
Here's a question from Dayang Nur Sakina Musa. Do you have any experience on reforestation after wildfire in the peatland area?
Oh, in peatland area. I do not. So they talk, does he mean like areas that have high peat content in the soil or high water table?
I bet. So maybe like, I'm thinking of Wisconsin, parts of the United States where we have lots of peat.
I think part of that, I think I've seen where they've, because the water table can be high, is, you know, creating a microsite where the trees initially got their roots a little bit up out of that water, and as they develop, they grow down into it, but not planting them actually in the waterlogged area. But of course, it depends on the species and their tolerance, obviously. But the only places I've seen that are seen it over in Ireland and places like other places, but I do not have any direct experience. I've got maybe a question for the group is how many here are actually seriously thinking about planting trees? Anybody?
You would have to answer the question in writing. I live on a site where the trees just naturally replant themselves, and then I am promoting. I've been losing a lot of Douglas fir for a lot of the reasons you stated tonight, and so I'm promoting ponderosa pine, sugar pine, and some of the hardwoods, madrone and oak.
Nice. We've experienced on the McDonald Dunn Forest out of Corvallis in 2015, we had what we call a hot drought. Not only were we in a drought, but we had 2 or 3 bouts of 98 to triple digit temperatures. And within 3 years, we had a massive amount of mortality, and we actually had flat-headed fir borers in Douglas fir, which often doesn't occur up in Corvallis. It occurs down where you guys are quite a bit here. And so we're seeing, you know, Douglas fir on sites that perhaps where they weren't there historically are really starting to flag out and die. You know, they seeded in over time. Maybe we planted them there. And now that things are getting hotter and warmer and these elevated temperatures, they're not happy. And so I'm looking at trying to promote pine and oak. And some of those sites previously had more oak on them. So that's telling right there. Is anybody doing any kind of salvage, post-fire salvage harvesting? Any yeses?
I volunteer for, we salvage wood for Jackson County Fuels Committee. And it's all trees that have died along the greenway, and
Oh.
they're hauling a lot of trunks, burnt trunks, to the site right across from where the woodlot is. And my understanding is that the plan is to chip the cottonwoods, and we're salvaging a lot of the hardwoods. There's a lot of oak and madrone.
And is that oak going to be sawn into some kind of lumber, or?
No, it'll all be firewood.
Oh, I'll be
It's
firewood.
fire-
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. For people that are unable to afford or having
Got
difficulty
it.
to afford
Got it.
their homes.
Okay. Well, any other questions from folks? I think we still got, what, 8 people on?
So I have a little announcement. The one question was from the Yang. I'm not sure if that is her first name. She's a lecturer at the forestry science at the University of Malaysia.
Oh,
And I don't know if she wanted to say anything about her work. That might be interesting.
yeah.
Hi. Yeah, my name is Dayang. Currently, I am a PhD student in University Putra Malaysia. So currently I'm doing a forest fire in pit swamp area. So that's why I really wanted to know if there's any reforestation idea in the pitland area, because previously I have experience. We planted a tree when I was a student in one of a burned area in Selangor, Malaysia. So what happened was, after 2 years, the area was burned again. So
Oh.
I think that's kind of a devastating experience when we plant a tree in the pit swamp areas. Just sharing my experience.
So did you have a fire that got into the peat? So it was a peat fire?
Yeah, it's a pit fire. So basically, pit fire is very hard to extinguish.
Yep.
So we can't. Yeah, it's very hard to control, even if you're doing like a canal to, like a drainage canal to separate the area, but it's just jump. The fire can jump to the other side, so it's very hard to control.
Yeah. Yeah, peat fire, that's an underground fire. Only thing worse than that are fires that get into coal seams.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to think if in Canada there may be, and maybe some of the boreal countries, like Norway, Sweden, they may have maybe techniques that they use in some of their peat areas for reestablishing trees on them. Like I said, my only experience that I saw was in Ireland, and it was very, very brief. Some of those areas can be pretty wet and hard to get trees back on site unless you create a artificial microsite that's built up a little bit so that it's not waterlogged.
I see. Yeah. I wanted to ask, because I am not experienced in reforestation area. So, what do you think about when we do a replanting from a natural bed? Because I read some research on the reforestation. One of the researcher, I found out that the researcher planted a tree inside a bamboo and then the researcher planned to plant the tree from the bamboo to the forest. So how do you think about that idea? Because it didn't come out with any results yet. It's just like a
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Boy, I don't have any experience. I'd be interested to see how that looks. Um, yeah, I wouldn't be able to comment. Sorry. Yeah, I don't. It's out of my experience realm.
Yeah, it's okay. Thank you actually for putting me on the spot. It was
Yeah,
really great to experience.
great.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Peggy. Peggy writes, at the base of my large white oak, there is a large hole for the gopher community. How much damage are they doing to my oaks?
So Peggy, have you seen the gophers going in and out? I mean, is there soil and all that? Um, can you actually see them?
Yes.
Huh. Um, I don't know. I suspect that even if they feed on the roots, the oak is well established. It probably is not going to hurt them. Go with little seedlings. When gophers come and clip the roots, or sometimes they clip the whole seedling off. But if they clip the roots, is that for seedlings? Every root that you take off, it puts them at a disadvantage for trying to um, absorb moisture. But for a larger oak that's well established, I don't think that they would be causing much harm to that tree.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, maybe we'll let Steve off the hook. George, did you have anything further to say at the end? I'm not sure if George is with us. Well, I guess we'll close a little bit early. There don't seem to be any more questions. Thank you very much, Steve.
Yeah, you're
I
welcome.
have a link in the chat if anybody would like to copy that down. And we're recording this, so that link will also become available.
Okay. Well, thank you all. I
But
appreciate it. It was fun. Like the questions. I'd rather be out on the field discussing this, as we all would, I'm sure. But anyway, that day will come.
yeah,
All right.
thank you again.
Okay, take care.